All right, this is my third run through. I'm trying to make the video short, but as informative as possible. We're in 8.4, which is the unit that deals with the impact of water pollution on ecosystems such as wetlands and mangrove swamps. Now, in particular, I want to first start by talking about what we get from these ecosystems. So I'm putting together notes. This will allow me to go slow. So point number one, what are the ecosystem services that are provided by wetlands/mangrove forests? We can break down the ecosystem services into four main categories. You've got regulation, you've got provisions, you've got cultural services, and you've got support services. Now I've included a link, and I'm going to put this up on Google Classroom, and you can see there is a whole list of ecosystem services that people can talk about. The first one, flood control, I'm going to put that one as a regulation. Anytime I hear the word control, I think regulation. And the flood control comes as a result of the fact that the soil in a wetland area can slow the movement of water. So as storm surges occur, think about a storm with heavy winds and very large waves full of energy. As the water comes up on land, if it goes through a wetland or a mangrove forest first, the water is going to be really slowed down. And if the water is slowed down, it won't have as much energy after it makes it through that wetland area. And also, not all of the water is going to make it through onto the inland areas where our homes are, our farms are, our streets are. So a lot of that water will be retained and held in that wetland area. So it slows the movement of water and absorbs water, retaining water. So think of the wetland as a huge sponge. And as the water comes up from either the bay, the sound, or a river, as it moves into a wetland area, a lot of that water stays there. So it doesn't rise as high in the areas where we live. So that's flood control. We can also think about another regulation. Reduces storm damage. The main reason it reduces storm damage is how do I phrase this? It takes the wind and wave energy and reduces it by the time the waves and wind hits the land. Now I know that you can't see everything, so let's try and make this a little bit smaller so you can see everything that I'm typing. I'm going to make the text a little bit smaller. And we'll reset that. All right, so they regulate by controlling floods. They regulate by reducing storm damage. They take the energy from wind and waves, and that energy gets dissipated as the waves crash onto the wetland area, and then all of the energy that gets through the inland areas will have smaller waves and weaker winds. Provisions. It can provide a lot of things that we take from the environment and harvest, in particular, fish. That includes shellfish and finfish. So shellfish and finfish. Earlier this year, I took about half of the class on a field trip. We went out to Nassau County to a marine science nature study area, and it was a wetland area. The ranger explained to us that in the 1970s, a lot of the wetland areas were being filled in so that we could create homes and farms. This particular study area was deliberately left untouched in pristine condition so that they could study the impact of wetlands on the entire ecosystems around them. And what they found was that in the water, the fish populations were healthier, they were larger. In general, the fishing was better because the energy from the sun to the food systems, all of the different food webs, made their way into the waterway. So energy was getting into the population of fish through the food web. So we realize now that it's not just water purification, but it supports giving energy to the fish. So we can think about this support service. Not only does it provide energy for the fish in the form of food, but it provides breeding grounds and nurseries for many different species of birds, aquatic organisms, and it also includes things like microorganisms and, of course, mammals and reptiles. I know one of the things he showed us, he had a stuffed mouse and something called a vole. And he showed us how these organisms were adapted to live in the wetland ecosystems. And they would, of course, those rodents provide food for the raptor birds like the osprey and the eagle. So these wetland areas, they provide habitat specifically for these animals to breed and then provide food for their offspring until they can go back into the larger ecosystem, because they don't live their entire lives in the wetland areas. And then the cultural values, of course, you can think about boating, sport fishing, and hunting, and just enjoying nature. Now, many people thought of wetlands as being sort of a smelly, useless, unenjoyable swamp. But the more you get to know, and if there was a raised boardwalk that you could walk through, you really can kind of get a sense of enjoyment of the beauty of nature. So they provide lots of services. And remember, this link will be here. You can include some of these other things in your list. The next thing I want to go over is what threatens these ecosystems. What human-induced threats are there? One of the ways that we can destroy them so that they can't provide those services is we can drain them and divert water. An example would be the Florida Everglades. Florida has a lot of swampland, and in particular the Everglades. It's a reservoir of biodiversity full of all the different functions we've talked about. But because we wanted that land for farming or even residential or industrial areas, we dug canals that would allow the water to go right from the land directly into the Gulf of Mexico. So all of that fresh water that was stored on land, we just diverted it right into the ocean so that we could dry up the wetland and use that land for something else. It wasn't until we understood the value of the wetland that we began to think about rehabilitation. What are some other threats to wetlands? Again, I'm going to include a link for you, and you can see things like building houses, development, roads, grazing, agriculture, mining. All of those threats bring sediment pollution. So sediment pollution, come on, from mining, devegetation, and devegetation goes along with mining. Devegetation goes along with construction, road building, and agriculture in general. And what I didn't realize is that some wetlands can be used for grazing animals, such as cattle. And when the cattle are trotting on that land, they're compacting the soil and changing the quality of the soil. They're also putting a lot of their wastes in there. But it could be a valuable area for farms to use, because one of the valuable parts of a wetland ecosystem is that they retain a lot of water. So if we go back to their services, in times of drought, drought, they retain water for adjacent ecosystems. So the fact that they hold and retain water means that anything growing next to them, forest or other vegetation, could utilize and kind of absorb some of that water and remain healthy. So they support neighboring ecosystems by holding on to that water. All right, so what are some other things that we can do? We drain and divert them by drying them up. Anything we do on land can bring sediments in. And then another pollutant would be nutrient pollution from farming primarily, but also those nutrients can come from septic systems, cesspools, and something as simple as a golf course. They use a lot of fertilizer to keep their greens really in pristine condition, and even residential lawns. So all of that fertilizer and nutrient is washing from the land into the local body of water. In the next unit, we're going to look at something called eutrophication. And we're going to look at the Long Island Sound and all of the things that are being put into the water from the land. We don't think of our areas as being heavily farmed like we do the Midwest, but we have all sorts of areas where these nutrients are coming from because we're densely packed. We have a lot of people living on the island. And we even have pollutants coming from Connecticut. So Long Island and Connecticut are both putting these inputs of nutrients from the land into the water. And that nutrient pollution can be absorbed and retained by those wetland ecosystems. Remember, the wetland ecosystems are among the most productive. That means a lot of plant growth. They're pulling not just carbon from the soil, but nutrients like nitrates and phosphates out of the soil and transforming it into plant tissues. So a threat to a wetland could be too many nutrients coming in. You can overload the ecosystem and they can't absorb enough of it. So if we look here at threats to wetlands, oh, you know what? I'm going to change this. The nutrient pollution is not a threat. They actually deal with nutrient pollution. But if we look at agriculture, the sediment pollution is really the problem. We can dump things. So it can be a dumping site, and we tend to think of them as dumping sites because they can handle the pollution. And they can become inundated. There can be too much pollution, and they just can't handle it. And now the wetland, not only is it not functioning, but the pollution is beginning to degrade the quality of it. And now it's becoming a toxic dump site. So there's only so much pollution a wetland can handle. Let's see. All right, those are the main threats. I'll put that link up there for you. The next thing, 3, pollution control. So what are the methods that wetlands control pollution? So they trap sediments. Mainly this is as the water flows off land, moving very fast, carrying things from urban areas like oils, grease, or from residential areas where construction and roadways are being built. Remember, when we devegetate, we're exposing sediment that can easily be carried by wind and water. As it moves over land, it moves very fast because the soil cannot infiltrate as quickly, or we have impermeable surfaces. The minute it hits this wetland area, the wetland area acts as a buffer and it slows the flow of runoff water and allows sediments and other pollutants that are insoluble to be deposited in the soil. The dense vegetation and root systems trap these solids, which is mostly sediment. So how it controls pollution: sediment pollution, nutrient pollution. nutrients from farms, golf courses, residential areas where people are using fertilizers, urban runoff, and cesspools. When we have a lot of people with cesspools, every time you flush your toilet, you've got nitrogenous waste products. You've got detergents in your wastewater. All of that's getting into the local body of water. If it moves through a wetland area first, the wetland area takes it out of the water and uses it as fertilizer. So the nutrients from all these different places are absorbed by plants in wetland areas, and they transform these substances into plant tissues. For example, proteins, cell membranes, think phospholipids, ATP, there's the phosphate, DNA, and RNA. So all of these chemicals are absorbed and they're chemically transformed. They're not remaining in their same form. They're assimilated and turned into different tissues. So we've trapped sediments and we've absorbed the nutrients, preventing those from getting into the water. So the water is not turbid or cloudy, and you don't have too many nutrients getting into the water. The third thing is absorbing toxins and bioaccumulation. Sometimes they call this process phytoremediation. There are some organisms, whether it's fungus or plant, that can absorb toxins from the soil, and it does not kill them, and they can store it in their tissues. So an example would be mangrove trees can absorb and store heavy metals in their tissues. Some of these metals are useful to the plant, but some of them are not useful, but the plant absorbs it from the soil anyway. So they're taking these metals out of the soil and preventing them from mobilizing into the estuary or the oceans or the bays nearby. So the plant holds them and traps them. It will hold them and trap them as long as the plant is alive. As the plant begins to die and break down, those metals could be re-released. Now, one thing we could do is we could take those plants and remove them and put them in a hazardous waste dump. If we wanted to think about it that way, if we knew that the plant was absorbing it while it was alive and we could selectively remove those plants, we could eliminate those toxic heavy metals from the environment entirely instead of allowing them to go back into the environment as the tree breaks down and dies and decays. The next method would be biological degradation. This is where organisms can break down toxins into less harmful chemicals. Now, your body detoxifies things all the time. When you break down proteins, you make ammonia, which is a toxin. Your liver turns it into urea, which is a less toxic chemical, mixes it with water and salt, and then you excrete it as urine. There are some chemicals that are persistent organic pollutants. When they go in your body can't break them down. They stay in their chemical form and they cause all sorts of problems with your endocrine system or cancers. But there are a variety of organisms that can take these pollutants and they may be able to transform them chemically into a form that some other organism can then take up as a food source or incorporate into their bodies. This idea of biological degradation, transforming or detoxifying chemicals, is an idea that John Todd, Professor Todd, has taken to heart, and he's creating these things called eco-machines. Now, this video is 54 minutes long, but I'm going to include it in the assignment if you want to watch it. I found it fascinating. This particular lecture, he's broken up into 3 parts. One of them is about healing the people, another one is about healing the air and the soil, and then the other one is about healing the waters. when he talks about this, he explains, and if you look at this picture, a lot of his eco machines are built in what he calls cells. He takes these artificial containers and he links maybe 10 containers together in series. The first container contains the raw polluted water, and he puts organisms in there, a variety of organisms, whether it's protists, microbes, fungi, or plants that can tolerate living in that toxic water, and they may be able to detoxify partially one or a few of those toxins. Then that partially cleaned up water goes into cell number 2, where there's an entirely different ecosystem of organisms that can tolerate this polluted water, and they may have a function to detoxify or break down the new mixture of pollutants. And as the water goes cell by cell by cell, the entire time the energy, besides the pump that moves the water from cell to cell, the main driving energy is the sun. And the organisms that grow there, they will reproduce, they will interact with each other. And the main thing that he creates are novel ecosystems, combinations of organisms from the 5 kingdoms that are not found living together in nature. But he might study a specific fungus and a specific bacteria that apart, they're known to detoxify. And when he puts them together in that ecosystem, they may even work synergistically to clean that water up faster and more efficiently. And by the time you get to the end of this cellular design, the water is clean and purified, and there's absolutely no waste left behind. And he calls these things eco machines. So I'm going to include that video for you. So we've got ecosystem services, threats to wetlands, using eco machines to mimic what natural wetlands can do in an artificial setting. Rather than creating an artificial treatment facility, he's using ecological design to do what a wetland would do. Now, this link I'm also going to include. It talks about wetlands and how they normally function. And you can see I've highlighted the 3 pollutant removal processes. I broke it down into 4: sediment trapping, nutrient removal, and chemical detoxification. And as you scroll through, it gives you a little bit more information. And the final point will be that when we inundate wetland ecosystems, natural ecosystems, with too many pollutants, they're overwhelmed and they can't break down those toxins or absorb them quickly enough. So it becomes unsustainable. And now that overwhelming amount of pollution, not only does the wetland not function, but it begins to kill the organisms that live there. And we lose all of those services, and we are causing the destruction of the wetlands. So we're literally killing the one thing that can help clean the pollutants in our environment. So we lose their functionality. So what can we do? How do we fix the destruction of these ecosystems from too much pollution? Now, the obvious question is just make less pollution. Or we could build artificial ecosystems like John Todd. We can enhance the existing ecosystems by giving them more potency, more ability to reduce and process these pollutants. We could create ecosystems where we once destroyed them, so we could just start building more ecosystems. So this idea of rehabilitation of wetlands is broken down into 3 steps. We can create new wetlands. Imagine we destroyed an existing wetland, such as the Everglades. Well, we could stop diverting the water into the ocean. We can stop draining it, and we can allow the water to flow right back into that wetland, and they'll recover back to what they once were historically. Or we can enhance existing wetlands. All right, so there's creating new wetlands, enhancing existing wetlands, and there was a third process. There were 3 things by the Clean Water Act that they outlined to protect wetlands and restore them. So I'm just going to find that document, and then we'll end the video. So let's see. Should be in my recent documents. Give me just a minute. I should have had this loaded up. I didn't think I would forget it. Here we go. I keep re-recording, trying to make the video shorter and shorter, and then I think of new things to say. All right, so you've got restoration, creation, and enhancement. All right, so let me go back to the notes. You can restore. So that's really what they did with, and your textbook has this, the story of the Florida Everglades. They restored it, returning it back to its original function by reversing the damage they did, not draining the water. You could create new wetlands. This means that you can take an area where there was no wetland and you can mimic the conditions necessary to create that new wetland. This can be really hard to do, and it may not function as well as natural wetlands. And then you can take existing wetlands and you can enhance them. You can expand them, you can feed them whatever it is that the wetland community needs to grow and be stronger. So these are ways that we can get that functionality of the wetland that we've destroyed from various activities and also over pollution. And this can help us to clean the water. So I'm going to put all of this information for you up on Google Classroom, and it will be all about the impacts of wetlands and its relation to pollution. There will be a Google form up there, and I'm going to ask you to answer the questions on the Google form, very much like you would answer the questions in a free response question.